take for granted. An example is, you saw me yesterday. For those of you who saw me come in, I came in a shirt and tie and a suit. I always travel in a suit and tie. I get better treatment. I could travel like you're traveling, like you are right now, or like I am right now, and I don't necessarily get the same treatment. People assume I'm there to work on the plane or all kinds of things, just automatically. And those are the kinds of privileges that you have, that merely by the complexion that you are, there are certain things that are granted you. And so Edie and I had some conversations about that. I'm clearly aware of that as I move about the world.
We have privilege based on many aspects of who we are. I think most of us here maybe are middle class. That affords us certain privileges. But certainly our skin color affords us other ones. In the workshop that we did this morning that I was involved in, we talked about mortgage lending, we talked a bit about credit, made references to jobs. There's evidence coming out now that mortgage lending of the predatory kind, subprime lending, was much more common, was even targeted at neighborhoods that were primarily people of color. Credit, we know. There's research that shows that if you're a person of color, it doesn't matter what your income is. If you're living in a neighborhood that's predominantly people of color, you're going to have less applications coming in the mail to apply for credit cards. And therefore, then if you need credit, you may have to go to a payday lender because you haven't got other options. In terms of the mortgages, in terms of the credit cards, the research shows that independently of somebody's credit history or their credit score or their income, there are still these disadvantages associated with being a person of color. There's disadvantages we know in the schools. Kids, think about this kind of zero tolerance policies some of our schools are adopting, where a kid does something that used to merit a trip to the principal's office or something. And for some kids it still does, but for other kids, more commonly people of color, it's not a trip to the principal's office, but it might be the cops being called and the kid, some young kid being in handcuffs or something, and being suspended under some kind of a zero tolerance policy, which even though is not written to have racial bias, is in the way it's enforced and the way it's implied ends up doing that. Think about the laws that provided penalties for being caught with or selling crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. Powder cocaine was used by predominantly whites, crack cocaine by African Americans and people of color, and the penalties imposed for having that drug in your, on your person were incredibly more harsh for being caught with the crack cocaine. So even though the laws are not written that say, it's going to be worse for people of color than it is for white people, or even though the institutions don't necessarily say we're going to target and, disadvantage and harm and charge more and penalize people of color, in fact, in the practice, for a number of reasons, it can end up that way. And so I'm going to say to Ervin, as white people of privilege here in this room, what advice would you have for us? We want to be allies to people of color. How can we do that? How can we acknowledge our privilege, and how can we act in ways that are being allies to people of color?
Well, you began by saying, how do we acknowledge our privilege? And I think that's the first place I would start. For instance, if one of your children get in trouble, the likelihood is you know somebody in the court system that you can deal with. If you don't, I look at phone books when I'm traveling, and I haven't seen a city where there are not more lawyers than doctors in the phone book. If you go to court, well, in Vermont you won't see it, but you go to court anywhere, You don't see white people in court. You see black people, you see Latinos, you see people of color, because whites know to send their lawyer. So that there are certain kinds of privileges that are built into that. Now, what I would say to you is to become conscious of that and to realize that there are folks who need your influence, who you can share your privileges with, who can make a difference. Now, I'm not saying throw it away. You know, you only got so many chips to use, but there are times when things happen. An example is that this country was laid out where every city, affluent people are in the West, poor people are in the East, usually black. And when integration occurred, it occurred north and south. But blacks knew when they went into a town to find a railroad track, go east. My experience right now is that if I go into the west side of any town, I feel nervous. Not about who might pull out a gun at me, except for the police. Now, you might feel fear if you go into the black side of a town, but you fear the people, you don't fear the police. So, there are privileges that we have that you can begin to influence and say, how do I make a difference with this system in my town that says that these things don't have to be tolerated. When I grew up, I remember when McDonald's hamburgers were 15 cents, but they wouldn't sell me one. And now I can buy one any way I have money. The question for me now is, who owns the McDonald's? So what are you doing with not only your privilege, but your money that can influence what happens to people?
And so as we go about our justice work, I think we have to be, we sometimes talk about we have to be savvy. I'm forgetting now how it goes. There's a snake in there somewhere. Be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents. Thank you. Probe beneath the surface. Understand what are going to be the implications for people that are not white, for people that don't have money. I think we know we have to be involved, but there's so many levels on which we have to be involved. We have to be, Ervin made reference to racial profiling. Stuff is hard to tease out, right? What is going on in people's heads?